bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone.
Grave diggers.
Hi everyone.
Hey folks, we're back.
It is knockoff Olivia Wilde, Erin.
Which is a compliment because Olivia Wilde is great and it's Amr in Toronto.
I got a round head, guys.
Yeah, for me, I've been compared to McLovin from the popular movie Superbad, so could be a lot worse, you know?
Yeah, and this is episode 50, and that's not even counting our Patreon bonus content.
Yeah, we're doing finely thanks to all you wonderful fans.
We're almost a year into the podcast.
Yeah, oh yeah.
We are back in Yemen today, and I learned a Yemen fun fact, and it's probably the only fact you're going to get in this episode that one might describe as fun, so treasure it. You might know that coffee has historically been one of Yemen's largest industries, but did you know that the word mocha comes from the Yemeni port city of Al-Makha, where the mocha beans were exported? So next time you're sipping on a cafe mocha, don't forget about Yemen.
Yeah, and that's where the fun ends because everything after this is depressing as hell. And if you need any further information, please check out our previous episode where we discussed the first part of Yemen's Arab Spring. Last time with the last episode, we left you with Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi taking power as an interim president for 2 years in February of 2012, having replaced Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had to resign following protests for almost a year. So that's a recap of the previous episode.
And then there were elections, and everything is good, right, Anwar?
Yeah, and that's the end of our episode, and they lived happily ever after.
Thanks for listening, guys.
For those of you who haven't shut down the podcast app, that's not what happened, as you might have heard. To get into the background of the second part, I want to clarify a few things. So there's a group called Ansar Allah, which are popularly known in the press as the Houthis. But the name Houthi comes from their founder, Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, and the name Houthi is the tribe he's from, the Houthi tribe. The official name is Ansar Allah, but everyone seems to call them Houthis. And they're a group formed in Yemen in the northern Sa'da governorate. And they're there to fight for Yemeni Shia rights because they're a Shia group in a country ruled by a Sunni clique.
The geography of the Houthis is actually quite interesting. If you recall our episode from last week, the Saleh government often framed opposition protests and movements as post-unification agitation by what was formerly South Yemen. But the Houthis originated and are based in North Yemen, thus undermining that excuse and demonstrating that disapproval of the Yemeni government and its policies is widespread. Additionally, the Houthis' proximity to Saudi Arabia means the royal family fears anti-government sentiments could spill over into the kingdom.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it is, like I said, the Houthis are Shia, they're Zaydi Shia, so they're not the same branch of Shiism as, say, the majority in Iran, which is Twelver, but to the Saudi government, any agitation by a Shia population is seen as a threat. The paranoid minds at the head of the Saudi government often link any agitation by Shia with Iran, and we're going to come back to that later in the episode over how absurd that claim is. But Ansar Allah, for the Houthis in particular, there have been Sunnification policies by the Yemen government in Sana'a that discriminated against them. And so this movement arose to fight that discrimination. And it launched a sort of low-level insurgency in the mid-2000s and supported the anti-government movement that emerged in 2011. The Houthis, however, boycotted the Yemeni elections in 2012 because they opposed the deal in which Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi was allowed to become the sole candidate for the presidency. They boycotted those elections. And then in 2014, Parliament passed a mandate to extend Hadi's term for another year. So he was supposed to have a sort of truncated 2-year term to act as an overseer for a new constitution and a new president. But then in 2014, Parliament said he could have another year, and the Houthis were livid at this new mandate.
And understandably so. Hadi was a leftover of Saleh's regime, and dictators often stay in power by chipping away at checks bit by bit until a lifetime has gone by and they're still president.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, despite what their goals may be, I can understand why they're very skeptical of Hadi. And the other issue here is that in the same year in 2014, Hadi announces cuts to fuel subsidies, which hurts working class and middle class families and was widely unpopular, leading to widespread protests. And those weeks of protests into September of 2014 escalate to an armed conflict when the Houthis defeat the Yemeni army and seize the capital of Sana'a.
The Battle of Sana'a actually only took a few days. Whether this is a testament to the Houthis' fighting skill or the weakness of Yemeni security forces, or both, I couldn't tell you.
I tend to lean on the fact that it's probably both. I mean, the Houthis are a fairly disciplined tribal militia, and in Yemen, tribal conflicts have been historically common, so having experience in that might help. But also, Yemen's military has never been a unified entity for really any point. I mean, there's still fractures among tribal affiliations. So I can imagine the military didn't really put up much of a stiff resistance. The Houthis, after taking Sana'a, they negotiate with Hadi to end the violence. And the initial deal that they get is that Hadi fires the prime minister and appoints a new cabinet. And the Houthis have a large influence in government through this deal. But fast forward to early 2015, and Hadi also proposes to split Yemen into federation with, highly autonomous federated zones. And that angers the Houthis, who end up, surrounding the presidential palace, and they force Hadi to resign.
Interesting how the regime characteristically paints rebels as parties trying to divide the country, and then just willingly attempts to chop up Yemen itself. Balkanization for me, but not for thee.
Yeah, it's almost like they want to be the ones who draw the borders instead of letting others draw the borders, I think. Yeah, and that conflict that's sort of surrounding the presidential palace, that's the sort of trigger for war, for like all-out war. Immediately, the Houthis form a revolutionary committee on February 16, 2015, with the idea of the committee being to oversee Yemen, to like act as a provisional government. Within that period, large numbers of defections from Yemen's army occur throughout March 2015, such that a faction loyal to the ousted President Hadi fights off an anti-Hadi faction of the military in Aden. So you have all these sort of factions breaking off and casting their lot with this or that particular leader or group. It's one of those things where it's not a war where you have just two distinct sides. You have all these different actors and they have their own interests. And the Houthis are very militarily disciplined. And on the 22nd of March 2015, they take Taiz, which is the third largest city in Yemen. And after that conquest, the Houthi commander, Ali Shami, boasts that they will move onwards to Mecca and Riyadh in response to very, very vague rumors that the Saudi government will interfere in Yemen.
Though I'd also love to see the liberation of the peninsula from the reactionary Sauds, this probably wasn't the wisest tactical move on al-Shami's part.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, with hindsight, of course, you could say that it wasn't the wisest move, but I, for one, tend to believe that the Saudis were planning to interfere well before Shami's comments. It's not like Shami's comments caused the change of mind in Riyadh.
Right, yeah. I just mean they're people I don't want to egg on. Like, they chop people up.
Absolutely, yeah. There's absolutely no reason to make them any more eager to intervene.
Please don't chop me up, MBS.
Yeah, I hope you never pop into a Saudi embassy. That seems to be the important key here.
No, I've resigned myself to never visiting Saudi Arabia, in part due to this podcast, but also because I don't want to. I don't want to give them my money.
Well, yeah, same here. Also, there's quite little to do in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, BDS Saudi Arabia.
At one point, I want to visit Mecca and Medina for the historical reasons. But yes, so within that period, on the 24th of March 2015, Hadi escapes house arrest, so he's been kept in his palace by the Houthis, and he flees Sana'a and to Aden, and there he declares that the Houthis are an illegitimate government and requests support from Saudi to back his so-called internationally recognized government. And that same day, Saudi began organizing a military campaign in Yemen and, sends airplanes to bomb Houthi positions.
From an article by Patrick Coburn dated April 5th, 2015, quote, "The Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen, which the Saudi Air Force began bombing on 26th of March, is codenamed Operation Decisive Storm. This is probably an indication of what Saudi Arabia and its allies would like to happen, rather than what will actually occur. A decisive outcome is the least likely prospect for Yemen, just as it has long been in Iraq and Afghanistan. A political feature common to all three countries is that power is divided between so many players it is impossible to defeat or placate them all for very long. End quote. In addition to backing from many of the Gulf states, the Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen received support from the United States and United Kingdom. I'd really recommend an episode of The Intercept and Mehdi Hassan's Deconstructed podcast from September of 2018 called Why is America Helping to Kill Kids in Yemen? The title pretty much says it all. The United States' support of Saudi's aerial campaign in Yemen has abetted the slaughter of Yemeni civilians.
Yeah, and it's particularly brutal, and we're going to get back to the brutality of it. But Saudi certainly wouldn't be doing this alone. I mean, the fact that the US is actively supporting them is crucial, because the Saudis alone wouldn't have gone at it, I think. At the same time as all of this is happening, the instability in the region allows Al-Qaeda, or their particular branch, Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, to take over eastern Yemen, which is largely desert with small towns spotted in between. On the 26th of March, just 2 days after Hadi escapes Sana'a, he flees Aden because Aden becomes surrounded by the Houthis, so Hadi flees Aden to Saudi Arabia.
In May of 2015, we see an M. Night Shyamalan level plot twist. Ali Abdullah Saleh, Yemen's former president and the Houthis' original nemesis in their opposition, openly allied with the Houthis in their pursuit of ousting Hadi. Oh, how the turns have tabled. But can Saleh be trusted to support a movement which he once politically subjugated? The answer is no, of course not.
Yeah, it's like the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy, but we'll fight together against a fifth enemy, and everyone's an enemy with everyone. Well, also everyone's a friend with everyone. It's very convoluted. But the lesson of this story is never trust anyone. Everyone is an enemy. In September of 2015, Hadi's forces retake Aden, of course with great Saudi support, including aerial campaign. Going into 2016, Oman and Kuwait both offer to act as mediators in negotiations between the Houthis and Hadi. Those negotiations yield nothing. We'll come back to that because Oman and Kuwait are they act as neutral arbiters in conflicts within the Middle East. And so they act as hosts for different factions to come and talk to each other. But at this point, the Houthis and Hadi are not interested in really coming up to a deal. On the 29th of January 2017, the US launches a raid by US Navy SEALs called the Yakla Raid in the town of Yakla in Yemen. And this is a raid that was planned by the US military under Obama. But Obama, in one of his only decent moves, scrapped it because he was afraid that the raid would lead to more entanglement of the US and Yemen. But within 5 days of Trump entering the White House, he approves this raid. But it's completely botched. It's a completely disastrous operation. 14 Yemeni civilians, including 9 children, were killed.
Why do they hate us, guys?
Yeah, I wonder why. But also, a US soldier is killed and 3 are injured. And you best believe that the Hollywood people will make a movie in 10 years of how this US soldier had a puppy and a kid, and his kid misses him, and his wife is crying, and etc., etc. And there's absolutely no mention of the 14 Yemeni civilians. The war at this point is becoming much of a fractal war, so it's more like a war within a war within a war. So at this point, you have a 3-sided war with the Houthis allied with Ali Abdullah Saleh on one side, the Hadi government supported by the Saudi-led coalition, with support strongly from the UAE, and they're based in Aden. And Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula is taking much of the eastern deserts. At this point, having been on the back foot for a while, the Houthis begin targeting Saudi Arabia's infrastructure with crude surface-to-surface missiles and drones. And most of them miss or are taken down by anti-missile defense systems. But some cause havoc in Saudi's oil infrastructure in the eastern provinces, as well as its airport in Abha in the mountains in the south. On the 2nd of December 2017, Ali Abdullah Saleh formally splits with the Houthis and openly calls for negotiating a peace deal with Hadi. And this causes a battle to erupt in Sana'a between Saleh's people and the Houthis. In that same day, Saleh is found and killed by the Houthis.
Welp, another one bites the dust.
With friends like these, who needs enemies, am I right? So, with Saleh gone, another faction pops up, and this is a faction that's been around for a while, the Southern Transitional Council, which is a movement formed in the mid-2000s, advocating a redivision of Yemen. As you heard in the previous episode, Yemen was divided into North and South Yemen up until 1990, when they unified into the Republic of Yemen. This STC faction has thought that the unification was a bad idea and they want to go back to being South Yemen. And during the war, having more hostility towards the Houthis, the STC formed a temporary alliance with Hadi. But this alliance is punctuated with fighting between Hadi's people and the STC in mid to late 2017 as their interests sort of diverge.
In summary, as we've said, Yemen's conflict has no true friends.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that the real conflict was the friends we made along the way, except nobody made any friends. The STC in January of 2018 take control of Aden, and this is after a sort of split within the coalition where the UAE sort of shifts its position towards backing the STC versus Saudi Arabia, which prefers backing Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi. So even within this so-called internationally recognized government that the coalition supposedly backs, there's divisions within the coalition and within the government where the UAE finds the STC a more pliable client, whereas Hadi is seen by Saudi Arabia as their man in Aden or their man in Sana'a or whatever. However, within a year in 2019, the UAE begins scaling back its involvement in Yemen, having withdrawn most troops and reducing its aerial presence. This largely because it has decided that Yemen, it's a sunk cost. There's just no political victory for the UAE, as well as its concerns that there's going to be more hostility with Iran closer to home. And that assumption is there's a whole lot going on there, but that fear of Iran has led the UAE to withdraw its support from the Yemeni war. Fast forward to another year in April 2020, and by the way, I'm skipping through the timeline just because I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of everyday fighting, just knowing that there's fighting almost every day between the different factions in different areas of Yemen, as different factions seek to control key areas.
Right, and you don't want to look at this like a football match of people scoring against each other.
Yeah, I mean, people are dying every day because of this, whether actively or through secondary and tertiary causes. And often it's, the fighting is brutal and over a strip of land. It's very gruesome fighting. In April of 2020, the Houthis and Saudi Arabia agree a sort of temporary ceasefire, a truce, to reduce the fighting amid the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, the STC in the south announces its plans for self-rule, which causes it to openly fight with Hadi again, having tried to reunify with him. Its plans for self-rule causes another split, and now Hadi and the STC are fighting in the south. In the end of 2020 into the 2021, so far, this is what we have right now, the Houthis control most of northern Yemen, including the capital Sana'a and the port city of Hodeidah, along with the Ma'arib Dam and pushing on to Ma'arib. The STC, the Southern Transitional Council, controls Aden and the south, having pushed out most of the Hadi government. And Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula group control most of the eastern desert, but have been strongly weakened by airstrikes by the US and the UK.
To quote Coburn again, and if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend his book, The Age of Jihad, where I'm finding these quotes. Our sources are compiled in a document that's always linked in the description. Quote, Yemen was in crisis even before the present conflict. According to UN agencies, malnutrition in Yemen is about the same as in much of sub-Saharan Africa, and only half the population has access to clean water. The country imports 90% of the grains used for food, but no ships are coming in because its ports are blockaded by the Saudis or caught up in the fighting. In any case, it is difficult to move food supplies because of a chronic shortage of fuel. Lack of electricity means that essential medicines and hospitals cannot be stored. This is not a short-term problem. Yemen is finally falling apart, but it may take a long time in doing so, which means that there will be a vacuum of power. Yemen has endured many wars that the rest of the world has ignored, but this one may prove uncontainable. End quote.
Yeah, Patrick Coburn, I was telling Aaron this before we recorded. He's one of my favorite journalists. He does have a way with words, and this is pretty much the most succinct description of Yemen. And, one of the things I've seen here is that a lot of news outlets have constantly been claiming for the past 6 or so years that Yemen is on the verge of famine. But surely the situation can now be accurately described as an ongoing famine because I've read, based on the research I've done for this episode, that Yemen imports 96% of its food during its peacetime. So surely having this war having gone for so long, it's now a famine, a genuine famine. And not to mention the Saudi coalition targeting port facilities in Hodeidah being the major port of Yemen. So having bombed out those facilities like, the machines that unload ships and move containers around, this drastically weakens Yemen's ability to import and has effectively caused a blockade, preventing Yemen from importing anything.
According to a report I found from the United Nations in December 2020, Yemen Civil War death toll was around 233,000 at that time, mostly from indirect causes like famine. But counting the dead is difficult, first due to the nature of war itself. People are fleeing, hiding, or maybe killed in aerial bombings, and their bodies are not immediately recovered and counted. Plus, what if someone dies of something like pregnancy complications and they couldn't seek treatment at a hospital because it was bombed by Saudi Arabia? Do you count that as a war death? I certainly would, but I'm pretty sure the US would argue against it.
Yeah, that's the good point. And I think on that note also, I think in our podcast, we've reiterated this point a lot, that outside of the death toll, there's also the casualty figures of people injured. And that can mean anything from a broken bone to being comatose or paraplegic. But in the case of Yemen in particular, with the lack of, electricity and functioning hospitals with ample medical supplies, even something as a broken bone can lead to long-term complications because it's not treated properly, for example.
I think as well, this language, being on the verge of famine constantly, is a way to placate people, a way to make us feel okay with what's happening in Yemen. The famine's not there yet, but it might be, it will be. A way to excuse United States and UK support of Saudi Arabia's aerial campaign, saying that things are going to get bad. They're not going to get bad. They are horrific right now, at this very moment.
Yeah, and they've been horrific for a really long time. Yeah, exactly. You hit the nail on the head, I think. It's a way of deflecting responsibility. And one part of that famine that I think is less covered is not just the people dying from malnutrition, but how malnutrition affects children growing up. So even if children survive this, which is a big if, by the way, how many of those children will have developmental issues growing up because they spent their entire childhood malnourished? Not getting the nutrition you need throughout the essential period of childhood in which you're growing, and your body needs nutrition to develop its organs and develop its bones and nerves and so on, means that growing into your teens and your adulthood, you're going to develop a lot of issues. We saw this in Iraq during the era of the sanctions in the 1990s, the horrific sanctions that caused so much pain. And we're going to see this in the next, 10, 20 years as the kids who grow up, those who survive at least, will be very stunted and very, there's going to be a lot of medical and developmental issues there.
Really good point.
Yeah, sorry to be depressing, but yeah. The other issue that now rings the bell is COVID-19, of course. I have yet to read anything about vaccines being shipped to Yemen. And apparently I've read that the pandemic has been spreading in parts of Yemen, though I can't find any accurate numbers, along with more disastrous diseases like cholera, where cholera has been more or less eradicated in most of the developed world. And it's often gotten because people drink dirty water. And it's a very, very awful, horrific disease to get because you're practically shitting your bowels out and then you die. It's not a pleasant experience by any means.
I was living in New York when the first bad wave of COVID hit, and I remember Cuomo on the television every day pleading with other states and the federal government for more medical equipment like ventilators. And Cuomo's a jackass, by the way. But if New York couldn't do it with relative economic prosperity, at least for the rich, and no war, I don't know how the people of Yemen could ever be expected to deal with a circumstance like COVID.
Yeah, we just mentioned that hospitals are struggling to store medication for lack of electricity. Somehow I don't think they have the electricity for ventilators in that sense.
No, definitely not.
Yeah. On that note as well, the Saudi intervention can really be classified as a war crime. It's like one continuous war crime. So one of the things we've mentioned is how Saudi deliberately targets civilians. One of their favorite strategy is the double tap or a triple tap airstrike. The double tap being an airstrike that hits a target, whether it's a market or a wedding or what have you, and then a subsequent airstrike hits the people who come to rescue the injured and the dead from the first airstrike. So once people sort of gather around the injured and the paramedics come in and so on, another airstrike will take them out. And the triple airstrike is the one that will hit the funeral the next day.
That's horrific.
Yeah, it is. It is. In addition to that, they've also targeted Médecins Sans Frontières facilities, despite knowing about them. And all of this, by the way, is the brainchild of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. So as much as you'll see New York Times gushing over this prick and how, Thomas Friedman loves him and this guy is like, reforming Saudi Arabia, everything that's happening in Yemen is a direct result of his actions and his desire to develop Saudi as a hegemon and has no concern for Yemeni lives and Yemeni civilians.
I can't believe that these people are so thick that they think showing the Emoji Movie in Saudi Arabia means that the country is becoming a better place. Like, clearly they're on his payroll or somehow a shill of the Saudi regime. But it's just absolutely ridiculous to claim that letting a small number of women citizens drive, for instance, is a mark of progress when women from Indonesia are literally being executed for witchcraft in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, it's horrific. And I oscillate over this, but sometimes I think I would respect them more if they openly get their money from MBS, because the alternative that they genuinely believe he's doing reforms is just even worse to me. Because if you're just getting money from MBS, and fair enough, you're a grifter, you're just you're his public mouthpiece, fair enough. But if you genuinely believe that he's a reformer, then you're an imbecile and a moron, and I could jangle keys in front of you and you'll probably be distracted.
Also, yeah, he is a reformer in the sense that he is consolidating power for himself and the Saudi regime for decades to come in the peninsula. Yeah, he's making a lot of progress. Good job.
Yeah, I'm sure a country like Saudi Arabia, where you can download an app that allows you to track your wife's movement, like literally track your wife's movement, and forbid her from traveling from the comfort of your smartphone, is definitely a haven for progress and reform.
I do want to briefly discuss allegations of Iran supporting the Houthis in Yemen. If you read articles in the mainstream press and even Wikipedia, they'll often refer to the Houthis as the, quote, Iran-backed Houthi rebels. This distinction is, in my mind, an attempt to frame the Houthis as the baddies or the axis of evil in Western cognizance. We don't refer to the Sisi government in Egypt as the Saudi-backed Egyptian regime, even though by definition it 100% is. This phrasing undermines discussion of the actual grievances of Yemenis and the causes of the war by framing it as solely a proxy issue. Meanwhile, the West accuses Iran of prolonging the conflict in Yemen by supplying arms for the Houthis when Saudi Arabia and the UAE massacred children from the sky. Honestly, I'm becoming ever more cynical of peace as a political objective. Often it's just coded language for passivity. If you gave up and stopped demanding an end to your oppression, there would be peace. And while war is terrible, its absence doesn't mean that people aren't struggling and even dying at the hands of those in power.
On the issue of peace and its passivity, you reminded me of the video that goes around of Ghassan Kanafani and that British BBC journalist person, where the guy is like, why don't you guys talk with the Israelis? And he's like, what do you mean talk? Peace for whom? Like, it's a conversation between the sword and the neck, as he describes it.
Right, a great quote.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting here is that all these grifters, all these freaks that the Center for Foreign Policy or whatever, the Hudson Institute, the Atlantic Council, all of the media go along with the same assumption that you have the Iran-backed Houthi rebel. But any person with the most remote semblance of understanding of the Middle East will tell you that the Houthis and Iran don't have much in common. Yes, they're both Shia, but Iran is a 12er Shia population and the Houthis are Zaydis. They're quite different in many ways. I will say that for sure Iran and Hezbollah have a very close relationship. There's real affinity there between the two factions. But the Houthis, they've never really been close to Iran. They've never really had any cooperation with Iran. And if they're getting weapons from Iran now, and it's a big if, it's only probably in retaliation for Saudi's involvement. It's a sort of direct response to Saudi's involvement that the Houthis have looked to Iran for support. And I don't blame them. I mean, if your enemy is raining death from the sky and this country has a couple of AK-47s for you and your friends, you're going to take it because what's the alternative? Just sitting there and waiting to die?
Well, the reduction of this conflict as a Sunni Shia proxy war is just not accurate. Take Salah as an example. Salah is Zaydi Shia, and the Houthis literally formed in opposition to Salah. So they started as an opposition to a political figure who happened to share a religion with them, but who they politically opposed. Then they formed this alliance not on the basis of religious sect, but for practical matters. They both wanted Hadi deposed, and then that alliance fell apart because, again, they have nothing in common.
Yeah, and they shot him. Hardly, a sign of support for your co-religionist when you put a bullet in his head.
Right, and the Saudi regime has long been sowing the idea that all Shia just have some sort of hive mind, and its only goal is to spell the downfall of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which they obviously see as a bad thing. But it's working in Western media.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to me how there is just little question. Even now, when you have some outlets are questioning the support for the war in Yemen, which, I mean, too little, too late. It's only been 7 years, guys. There's still no questioning of the fundamental relationship with Saudi Arabia. Like, I have yet to see anyone from the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of those freaks sit down and question, why are we supporting Saudi Arabia? Like, what do we get from Saudi Arabia that's worth it? It just boggles my mind.
We get oil, basically, but hopefully with something like a Green New Deal, and that's only the ittiest-bittiest start. But something like that will make the West far less dependent on Saudi oil, and we can move on from being their war dogs.
Yeah, it's grim. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know if Yemen will ever recover from this. And if it does, it might take years or decades. And like I said earlier, the effect of this will be seen for generations of Yemenis, like the effect of malnutrition, of injuries, of disease. Even those that survive the war, assuming the war ends anytime soon, even those that survive will face a long uphill struggle to really live a life that's dignified in any way, shape, or form.
Right. And additionally, Yemen's infrastructure has been completely destroyed. Ports, hospitals, everything you need to run a safe and secure country has just been obliterated.
Yeah, you just said ports, but it's also important to understand that Yemen imports most of its food, and also from the ports to the interior, there are all these roads that the Saudi government has bombed out. So even transporting food to the interior is a whole other problem altogether because there are no roads in Yemen anymore.
Yeah. We leave you with that very depressing outlook.
Yeah. Next up, we'll have the very also depressing analysis of Syria.
Yeah, we're rounding out our Arab Uprising series with that. I think it is a good one to end with, first because we might have to take a good bit of time on Syria, but also because there are a lot of angles to explore. And as in the case with Yemen, I think the way you decide to look at it, if you want to look at this as a Sunni Shia war, then that is what you'll see. If you want to view it as an ethnic conflict, then that is what you'll see. If you want to see it through the lens of violence against women, that is also there. So the way we approach it is actually crucial to how we're going to understand it.
Yeah, exactly. Well put there, yeah.
If you like our content, you can find us on Patreon. The link is always in the description. We have a review that we recorded a couple days ago of A Bug's Life, 1998, coming out.
A lot more lighthearted content than this.
Yeah, we do a lot of different stuff over there, current event stuff as well. So please check us out if you enjoyed the podcast, or you can rate, review, subscribe. Those ratings really drive up the podcast in the algorithm, and that's really the best way to get exposure.
Yeah, expose us, please.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We've really had, I wouldn't say a fun time, but
An
time
interesting
doing
time.
this series. Yeah.
We had time.
So join us next week for Syria. We're approaching Syria in a bit of a different way, but I think it's the right way to go about it.
Yeah, we're approaching Syria the same way Salah ad-Din's army approached Syria, which is from the south, taking Damascus and then Aleppo.
So we will catch you guys next week, or for our Patreon subscribers, sometime in the next couple days when I have a chance to edit that episode because I work a lot.
Yeah, take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.